Okay, so thank you everybody for joining, both here in the room and also on our live stream as well. So my name is Leo Murphy. I'm a technical specialist at Fauna and Flora International. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about science-based targets for nature and the context of net gain and no net loss around the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to introduce the general scene that we're going to be discussing, and then I'll hand over to our panelists, which will each give a short presentation, and then at the end we'll have some panel discussion and also some chances for questions from the audience. We've got a great number of speakers here today. So we have Johnny Hughes, the CEO of WCMC and Dsbtn Council member. We have Mark Johnson, the strategy lead for nature-based solutions at BP. We have Adeline Sirk, a senior principal consultant at the Biodiversity Consultancy. And we have Clem Fournier from WCMC as well, who's an associate program officer with the business and biodiversity team. So just to kick off and explain sort of the context of why we need these kind of initiatives in the first place, I think it's now abundantly clear that biodiversity is at the heart of everything that we do as a society and as an economy. But that this relationship that we have with biodiversity has become an increasingly one-sided one where we are extracting and depleting biodiversity for economic and social gains, but without giving the regard and the protection needed in order to ensure that it is sustainable and able to thrive in the long term. And as a result of that, I think we can see that this is just not going to be something we can continue to do any longer. You only have to look at the news over the last couple of days and weeks, or even to look around this room and see the number of people wearing masks. We saw fires through southern Europe over the last couple of days. We've seen floods in some of the world's biggest cities. And we see droughts and water scarcity in increasingly larger areas of the world. So it's becoming obvious that now what we have is a system that is living outside of its means, outside of the planetary boundaries. We can see here on the right-hand side. And we need to make a change in order to do something about this. We've seen from the IPBES report last year that there are now estimated to be 1 million species threatened with extinction, and that there are huge drivers of this coming from right across the different sectors, from land use change and sea use change to direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive species, amongst some others as well. And this is something that we really now need to come together to address. And there's a massive role for this in this for the private sector. And it's also really interesting that the private sector itself has become more aware of this over time. I think if we look on the left-hand side of the slide, we can see something which I think is both a positive thing and also potentially also a negative, depending on the context. This is the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. What are the real risks to businesses each year? And we see that back in 2010, biodiversity was barely on the scale. It was right down at the bottom. And we see over the 10-year period, it's rocketed right up to the top of that. And we can see this as a positive in that business is increasingly taking this as a material issue, something that they do need to do something about. But also we can look at the negative side of that and say, well, it's been going up and up and up, and we've not managed to do anything about it yet. So we really now are at a point at which we need to start taking some of those actions and not just talking about the potential change that we need. It was also very interesting to see last year the Dutch central bank launching a report which investigated some of the companies with which they're invested in, and identifying that there was over 500 billion euros of exposure within their portfolio to companies that are either highly or very highly dependent on biodiversity. So there's a real risk for the private sector as well. And we are now at as I've said, a key tipping point. You know, we have this context here as the Congress. We have the Glasgow Climate COP coming up, and closely followed by the CBD COP just after that. So we are at this point where we can make these large-scale commitments, but we have to be aware that also, we've made these kind of commitments in the past. We've not managed to meet the Millennium Development Goals. We're not necessarily on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals either. The ACHI targets have also been and not been able to be achieved. And so we need to make sure that we're not only going to be committing and pledging these targets, we need to find ways to actually take action in order to achieve them. And this is a key thing for right across businesses and society. These two systems are completely linked. So our social system interacts with the ecological system and can affect things not only at the sites at which businesses operate, but also right across the world. So we need to make sure that we have the systems in place to understand what the impacts are and how we can address them. And as I think it was Martin Locke yesterday who was saying, we need to find ways to track and measure these changes. If we don't measure something, it won't get done. So we need to find ways and approaches to be able to transition us between these two different systems. Excuse me. From degraded landscapes into resilient ecosystems. How do we get from depleting extraction to restorative extraction? From unsustainable farming to climate-smart agriculture? And what we're going to hear now is some transitions discussing how we can make businesses become more nature positive and how the science-based targets approach is able to assist businesses in doing this. So what I'd like to do now is welcome Johnny Hughes to the stage to talk a little bit about the Science-Based Target Network and what we mean by nature positive. Johnny.
Great, thanks, Leo. It must be serious if I'm up there as Jonathan Hughes, because I was used to be when my mum was angry with me, she didn't call me Johnny, she called me Jonathan. So it's yeah. So I'm really Johnny Hughes. As it says there, I am a Dsbtn council member, but my day job is that I work for UNEP WCMC, and I also sit on the ICN council as well. So I'm wearing a number of hats today, but principally the one of Dsbtn council member. Yeah, so what is the Science-Based Targets Network? It is part of the Global Commons Alliance, which is this partnership of more than 70 of the world's most forward-looking organizations, and they include organizations from philanthropy, from science and business, advocacy organizations. The aim of the Global Commons Alliance is to create the most powerful network to scale science-based action and protect people and planet, as Leo's been outlining. Science is very clear. It's telling us that nature and climate and the social crises are interlinked, intertwined. We cannot impact or act on one without impacting on the others. And we believe that companies in the private sector should be tackling those crises simultaneously to accelerate action, but actually create benefits for business in the longer term. We've seen quite a lot of movement on the climate front, but I think nature is kind of catching up. It's possibly kind of 10 years behind in terms of the metrics it's developing and the adoption by businesses of those metrics to drive systemic change. There's 1,500 companies that have signed up to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which was the kind of climate precursor to the Science-Based Targets for nature. And we've actually got some statistics on how that has helped transform business practices for the benefit of the planet. So we know that from working with those 1,500 businesses that global emissions from energy and industry has increased by around 3.4% over the 2015 to 2019 period. But for those companies that have set science-based targets for climate, emissions have actually decreased by 25% in the same period. So we know this works. We've got an industry baseline. We know that those companies that have signed up to setting targets are achieving pretty rapid results. And if we can do that for nature, then we're really making progress in the next 5 years. So Dsbtn it's a very wide network. The Science-Based Target Network that kind of sits within the Global Commons Alliance is over 50 leading global non-profits with, and there's also several other mission-driven organizations within the network. And they draw upon the technical expertise of the core partners, and UNEP WCMC is one of those core partners, but they include things like CDP, Conservation International, UN Global Compact, Worldwide Fund for Nature, and the World Economic Forum. So there's a number of key organizations that with very deep scientific expertise that are at the core of the network. And having a kind of network approach has, I think, two principal benefits. The first one is that it sends obviously a very unified and we would hope very loud message to businesses and to stakeholders that and indeed investors and governments that science-based targets is the direction that we need to go in. There is consensus around the idea of taking a science-based approach. And what do we mean by science-based approach? Maybe I should try and throw some light on what it actually means. What we mean by it is that targets it's setting targets that stay within those Earth's limits that Leo was just putting up on the board. This idea of staying within planetary boundaries, as well as aligning to societal sustainability goals that have been set both within the Sustainable Development Goal framework, but also increasingly now as we see emerging in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So what we mean is science-based targets are actionable, they're measurable, they're accountable. They relate back to metrics that can be clearly measured and reported on. There's obviously a very strong business case for this, as well as a moral case. It makes business sense. The World Economic Forum's report last year on nature and business estimated that a nature-positive economy can unlock 10 trillion of business opportunities by transforming in three economic systems areas that are responsible for almost 80% of nature's loss, and that's food systems, infrastructure, and energy. So those are macro figures, but they apply just as much local business level in a local context as they do at a global level. So, how can businesses contribute to a nature-positive agenda through engaging with science-based targets and setting science-based targets? At Dsbtn, the mission and approach to target setting is rooted in this concept of nature-positive. Setting a science-based targets for nature can be the lever, can be the beginning of the journey towards a nature-positive business. The network is using the best available science, as I've already said, from a number of those core organizations, underpinned also by the work that the Earth Commission is doing, which is another facet of the Global Commons Alliance, to identify what is needed for companies to stay within the Earth's ecological limits, those planetary boundaries. I would say at this point, I think we've got to be honest that nature is very different to climate. As you probably heard me say in other sessions, a ton of biodiversity is a very different thing to a ton of carbon. A ton of carbon is commensurable with another ton of carbon. A ton of nature is not commensurable with another ton of nature, and there's a whole array of complexities in the way that nature functions, from the genetic and the species level right up to ecosystem functioning. So we can't kid ourselves that this is quite as straightforward with dealing with that kind of 1 ton of carbon, and coming up with the equivalent of a ton of carbon for nature is a difficult job. However, and I think this is the big however really, because I know that businesses are on, they're exhorting the conservation community to give them some simple metrics that they can measure and get on with actually achieving some actions and making some real progress. So the however is, we do think there can be a boiling down of some core linked indicators to gain a holistic measure of biodiversity performance, which can be aggregated both from the site level up to the corporate level, to provide clear reports on biodiversity performance impacts, dependencies, and pressures. So whilst there may not be a single magic figure, we think we can get to the point where there can be a core set of indicators which will enable companies to report. I've probably spoken for about 10 minutes, and I think I should probably wrap up and pass on to my colleagues, pass back to my colleagues. But yeah, I suppose my one key message from all this is that we are on the cusp of being able to provide businesses with a set of core metrics which they can track and report, and most importantly take action on. And I think we've done a lot of talking over the last decade or longer on getting to the point where, you know, we all know we need this, and we're right on the cusp of it. So it's a very exciting moment, I think, for in the history of nature conservation. We're almost at a kind of inflection point. In the meantime, I would encourage any businesses, because we do have a bit of development to go. We're going as fast as we possibly can. In the meantime, I would encourage businesses not to wait for the perfect, and not to wait for, because we'll always be developing indicators, we'll always be refining metrics, but to act, to get on with setting some targets and actually turning up on Monday morning at work and thinking, okay, I'm going to do some action today. I've been reading a book recently called Atomic Habits. Some of you may have read it, by a chap called James Clear, that talks about how you develop good habits and try and rid yourself of bad habits. And he talks about the difference between motion and action. Motion being, you know, the planning, the discussions, the analysis, all the things we do in our daily weeks. And the difference between that and action is, you know, actually getting on with it. In some senses, the job of the Science-Based Target Network is to use the motion to come up with a set of metrics. The job of the business community, I think, is to move to action as quickly as possible, because we only have a decade in which to act, both on the climate crisis side of things and on the nature crisis side of things. So let's move from motion to action, I think, is probably my key message, and that, I think, is the niche and the difference of the Science-Based Targets Network, because it's saying, let's get some targets out there and let's get some action going on the back of those targets, and let's not wait for the perfect. Although, as I say, I think we're very close to getting some really, really robust metrics.
Yeah, I think we can have a round of applause there. Thank you very much, Johnny. And now I'd like to introduce Mark Johnson from BP, who's going to talk a little bit about BP's work on this.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the comment. There's a great summary there, and I can absolutely, completely agree with everything you said there, particularly that focus on action. We can spend too much time on the metrics and that side of things, where we just need to put action in place, because it could take several years before we get the metrics sorted out. So absolutely. So hi, everybody. So I'm Mark Johnston. I'm strategy lead for biodiversity and nature-based solutions in our environmental sustainability team in BP. And I want to give it a bit of an overview of what we're doing in BP in this space. It is a bit of a journey. We are learning as we go, but we are transforming and learning and performing and all the usual jargon that goes with it. So a little bit in terms of aspects. So last year we launched a new biodiversity position, and then also last year we launched a new sustainability frame around 3 core areas which are sort of fundamental to our business. One is about get to net zero by 2050 or sooner for carbon. So that's sort of the carbon aspect of our business. Then we have another one, improving people's lives, the social aspects of what we're doing. I'm fitting that. And then also about caring for our planet, the environmental aspects. And each of those 3 different areas, we've set aims. So we have 10 aims for carbon, 5 aims for people, 5 aims for the planet, as we're calling them. And each of the aims, we have targets, specific targets at a corporate level. I haven't got time to go through all the details. All the information is available on our internet. Obviously, I just want to focus on the biodiversity aim and our objectives. There's quite a bit of detail here, but again, it's all on our internet. So we set an aim for enhancing biodiversity across our operations where we operate. And under that broad aim, we have 3 relatively specific objectives. Highlights are here, again, the details we're working on. And under this biodiversity aim, I should say we're working very closely with Fauna and Flora International. We have Pippa and Leo and the team who are working with us. And they're working with us on how do we actually implement these objectives. how do we actually get these, what's the technical detail behind them, and how do we embed them into our projects and operations? So the first aim is to achieve a net positive impact on biodiversity in our projects from January 2022, and it's all projects. It's not just the big projects, it's the small ones, it's renewables, it's oil and gas, it's carbon capture, it's all our projects, regardless of the size, regardless of what location they're in. There is some caveats, it's obviously about direct impacts and where we have a potential significant impact on biodiversity. In BP, we probably have in a 1 year about 3,000 projects on the go at any one time. Most of those will have no impact on biodiversity because they're just retrofitting bits of kit in our operations, and there's no impact, so we need to filter that out. We then have objectives around enhancing biodiversity around our major operating sites. Not biodiversity action plans, but enhancing biodiversity. So actually be pressures on our existing operations, be doing work about enhancing the biodiversity around where they're working. And the third one is about supporting conservation projects in the countries where we're working. And details of that are going to be releasing next year. And all those three aspects is really important. And yesterday we asked about, well, is this just greenwashing? Well, if it is the third objective only, yes, I would say it was greenwashing. But what's important is actually embedding it into the way we work, into operations and projects, to make sure we get that net positive outcome. We talk about targets and metrics. We're working on it. We have set targets for each of the aims. These are, at a moment, process-based targets. So there's another small print in there. It gets quite complicated with projects in terms of delivering actions. But what we're saying that projects, each individual projects, have to deliver the actions within 3 or 5 years' time, 30 or so, I get it right, 30 or 90% of all the mitigation measures within 3 to 5 years. And we're reporting on the progress for that. That's the implementing the actions themselves. And again, we're reporting on that every year. That's where they are now. They are process-focused, but I think we didn't want to put outcome-focused targets until the Dsbtn have told us what we should be doing. So we didn't want to put something out there in advance and then have to change what we're doing. So these are sort of work in progress, and I suspect we will see modifications to these as we move forward. So that's an overview. This is a bit more of a detail. There's quite a bit of detail on the slide here. I won't go into the detail here. I'll be talking about it in a bit more detail this afternoon. We're currently working on the methodology for NPI with FFI and what that actually means. It does mean a lot of additional work for a lot of our projects, assessing a baseline, identifying key biodiversity features, setting targets for those biodiversity features, and then obviously setting the targets and the metrics to meet those particular targets. But it's very focused on the individual projects or individual sites. A couple of things, it is of course using the mitigation hierarchy, absolutely, frigidly across a project with a focus on avoidance, which keeps coming up. And then also another point, which I know has been sometimes a bit controversial, is we're using a fixed scenario, baseline scenario. So a project basically does assessment before the impacts, assesses that baseline, and that's the baseline we're trying to get back to for that particular project and above for net positive impact, rather than any counterfactual baseline. Be quite interesting to think about then how that fit in with the more global or national or global targets for NPI and restoration. So in terms of some of the key questions, we're talking about a lot about net positive impact on projects. Well, the next step is then net positive for value chain at corporate level. There's a big step there which we need to really better understand. And then how do we incorporate some of these metrics across all our operations and projects and some of the key challenges? Because we've got everything from terminals, seismic, drilling activities, carbon capture, offshore renewables, offshore wind, solar. How do we collate the sort of metrics across all the wide range of different activities? So this is how we're doing it at the moment. Link back to the sort of the frame in the Dsbtn. At the corporate level, I've just already mentioned those about the process level and ones we're working on at the moment, which we may expand. But we're currently developing a framework for our projects on how they identify metrics. And I think there's some very nice synergies there with, for example, the GBF and some of the goals there. Because we're basically providing guidance to our projects and sites about what sort of metrics and targets do they need to be setting. Because, of course, it depends on the local biodiversity within that area. And I've got this is just a snippet from draft 1 of the GBF, where it highlights, globally a 5% increase in the area and connectivity and integrity of ecosystems now. 5% to me doesn't sound very much. I would certainly like to see more. We'd be advising sites, projects to be looking at least 10 or 20% increase in the baseline. But we don't actually set that for globally as a corporate. It's up to individual projects or sites to set that baseline. So that's a little bit of a snippet where we are. Just a quick overview, and I'll be talking a bit more about it this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And yes, some really interesting points, the details of which we will have a session on this afternoon here, where, yeah, I think we can get into some of those details around how do you actually start to implement this at an individual site. And from the work that we've been doing, we know that that's not necessarily a straightforward thing. Often you come with a number of questions and you leave with 20 more, but it's a good process to be involved in. I'd now like to hand over to Clementine Fournier from UNEP WCMC, who's going to talk a little bit about the work that they've been doing to road test the Dsbtn guidance.
Ooh, that's not. Yeah. Yes, perfect. All right. Thank you, Leo. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Clementine. As Leo said, I worked at UNEP WCMC, and today I will be talking about how we are road testing the initial guidance on setting science-based target for nature for GSK. And before I go into the more detailed part of the project, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the context. And first of all, for those of you who haven't heard about them, I'll just present GSK. So GSK is a large pharmaceutical company that is headquartered in the UK, and they have two main business functions. One of them is biopharma and vaccine, and then the other one is consumer healthcare. So that means over-the-counter medicine or oral healthcare products like toothpaste. And in November 2020, they've actually set some very ambitious goals of having a net zero impact on the environment by 2030. So that means not only net zero emission by then, but also becoming nature positive by 2030. And as part of their overall strategy, they've joined the Dsbtn corporate engagement group. So you can see here a snapshot of some members. And so what really that group is about exchanging knowledge around the Dsbtn, but also try and test the initial guidance. So you have here a picture of the initial guidance that has been published by Dsbtn in September 2020. And actually, even more precisely, GSK, they have, as part of their work at the corporate engagement program, they have to try and implement step 1 of this guidance by early next year. And so before I go on into more detail of the work we've been doing with them, because here actually UNEP WCMC is collaborating with GSK to implement step 1, I will just give a quick overview of the Dsbtn initial guidance for those of you who haven't heard about it or might not be familiar. And the first thing to know about the initial guidance that has been published is that there are 5 main steps. Number 1 is the one we'll focus on today, and that's our work with GSK. It's about really assessing the impact and dependency of nature of your business. Number 2 is when you have that list of impact and dependency on nature, you have to interpret them and prioritize. Number 3 is about setting your actual targets and how you're going to measure them and then disclose these targets. Then after that is really all about action, so a bit about what Mark has actually mentioned, how you're actually going to decrease your impacts and your dependencies. And then number 5 is tracking your progress. And then here, zooming a bit more on step 1 and 2, these steps are really about understanding which issues areas, so impact and dependency on nature, are important for your business, and then also where in the world they actually are going on. So going back to what Johnny actually mentioned, which is that nature, it's not location agnostic. You really need to know where the impact is happening. So yeah, really first step 1 is gathering that data, and step 2 is you're having that list and you're prioritizing. And step 1 is actually broken down into 3 sub-steps. So you can see them there. It's a bit small, but you have 1A, which is a sector level maturity assessment. So it's really having a quick scan of what the impact and dependency on nature would be for your sector to get started. Step 1B is about actually starting to mapping your full value chain and having these impact and dependency for each step, and with geographic information. And here I just wanted to mention that when I say value chain, what I really mean is not just direct operation of your company, but also what's happening upstream and what's happening downstream. And then finally, step 1C, which is about company level refinement, so really looking at what is specific to your business and might differ from your sector in general. So let's deep dive into the actual detail of the project and what we're doing with them. So let's start with step 1A. That's the sector level maturity assessment, and the first step is really understanding in what sector or what are all the activities of your business. And that might sound trivial, but for a large company like GSK, it might actually take a lot of time. So you have actually here a big business with 2 business functions, and you need to determine what are exactly the activities. And so the tool that is actually used for step 1A is the sector maturity tool, and you have a screenshot of that on the next slide. But it's actually giving ratings for each sector, but for really each activity, and it's done in the ISIC classification, so it's a UN classification of industries, and you have a number of categories that are called classes. So here we've had discussion with GSK, and these are the classes that we've identified with them that were relevant to their business. So you have something about obviously manufacture of pharmaceutical, their activities in their head offices, their R&D's activities, and then at the top, the things that are more related to oral healthcare that I've mentioned at the beginning. And initial lessons of what we've done is, it's a very important step. So you need to get this right, because that's going to actually influence what you're going to do for your maturity rating after that. And also that you will probably need some discussion internally to try and understand who is doing what is actually part of your direct operation, maybe some activities your supplier might be doing them, what is really material also to your company. So that's the first step. And then the second part is really looking at these different categories that you've identified, so these classes, and use that tool to get out from it all of the ratings for the different impact areas. So what you're seeing here, the different columns, are impact areas that are clustered under the pressure of nature, on nature, that have been identified by the IBES Global Assessment in 2019. So these are things like water use, the soil pollutant that you're producing, or the ecosystem land use change, for instance. And so what the tool is giving you is a rating between very low and very high of the impact of your company. So on the top you see upstream, because we're again looking at the full value chain, and direct operation at the bottom. And the first thing you can see probably here is that we have some gaps in that matrix. So it's still being worked on by Dsbtn, but obviously if you're using it as a company, you have to expect at this stage that you'll have some gap to fill. So what we've done with GSK is obviously first do a literature review on some of the impact that have been done, because again it's at sector level, so you can find scientific paper on that. And then also one of the things that we have actually done is to fill some of these gaps that are in blue in here. You can see in upstream, actually use the matrix, identify who are the suppliers, and find the ratings for their direct operations to fill this gap. And also, I have here upstream direct operations, but actually at the moment, all downstream ratings are some research on our end to identify who are the sectors that are downstream to pharmaceutical, and also consumer impact. So that's for 1A. The next step from that is 1B, and that's the real, when the real stuff gets started, because you have to actually map the full value chain of your company. And again, for a company like GSK that have a complex supply chain, that means huge amount of data. And even if they do have huge amount of data, so again, it's about mapping the full value chain. You have a graph on the left, and it's really what are my supplier doing, what are their impact and dependency at each step, and where in the world they are, because that's obviously going to influence what the impact and dependencies will be. So even if you have lots of data and you do have to prioritize which one are the most important, but you will have also some gaps for key issue areas. Maybe some data from suppliers that you won't have, or even something precise about impact and dependencies. And that's where you will probably require some modeling. So what we're setting up at the moment is using some input-output modeling with, for instance, GTAP or XUBase for those of you who are familiar, to really map and model this missing data. So that's what we're doing for step 1B, and then finishing with step 1C, which we've not yet started, but one thing we expect at that step is actually having data-related challenges. And what that means is, because this step is really about looking at what is supposed to be material for your sector, and looking if some of the things might not actually be from material for your specific company, because everyone is a bit unique. And also looking at what could actually is not material, expected to be material for your sector, but could be material to you as a company, because again, you're different. But that will require a lot of data to actually prove that why you're different from your sector. You have to justify that. And then obviously probably a lot more challenges ahead. And so I'll just finish with some lesson learned and some challenge that we've encountered. So just feedback on our experience. So I'll start with the challenges. So as you've seen, one of them was actually filling the gap with the methodology being still developed. So actually, I have to mention that Dsbtn, and that's my last point on the bottom left, that they are incorporating all that feedback as we're speaking. Jenny was also mentioning that we're always developing, we're always just building on that feedback. And there would actually be a revised guidance that will be published at the end of 2021 or early next year with all these updates. Another challenge to the sheer size of operation and the prioritization that was needed. And then obviously something about all the data. So finding the right data source, whether it's internal data from the company or modeling data, so primary or secondary. And lesson learned that we want to share with those of you that might be brought to actually do that for your own company. So keeping discussion open with Dsbtn, because that guidance is updated, but also provide them with feedback. Do talk to them, because that's how the guidance is improved, is with feedback from actual company trialing this. A point about collaborative effort. So here we are, UNEP-WCMC helping GSK. It's really two-way collaboration, us bringing the biodiversity expertise, but them their deep knowledge of their company. There's no way we could do that without them. Building on existing data initiatives, so that's really important. You will have already things that are done, especially in big companies. So it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about using what has been done and building on this. And then finally, yes, follow the guidance. It's here to help you, but make it work for your company. It's really important because there is not one size fits all. So it's really important to just use common sense. Right, and that's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and to GSK as well for letting us talk about this.
Thank you very much. And yeah, now finally we will just hand over to Adeline, who will talk a bit more about what companies can do now. We heard from Johnny before that we want to move from motion to action. Well, here's what we can start doing right away. Adeline.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, just to introduce briefly the Biodiversity Consultancy, we are co-lead of the Biodiversity Hub of the Dsbtn network, and we are also working a lot with companies to help them to manage their biodiversity risk, measure their footprint on biodiversity. So yes, today a lot of companies are wondering if they can already set up targets, even if the global society goals are not developed yet, and how they can take action, how they can make sure that they won't do things that are not in the right direction. So even if those global goals are not set up yet, we have now some direction of travel. So we know that we aim to get to be zero net loss by 2020. We want to be net positive by 2030 and to get a full recovery by 2050. So before we can explain what it will mean for the company, I have to introduce just a few concepts. So when we speak about the impact of a company, we are speaking about their direct operation, but they will also have to consider their value chain, so upstream and downstream. As we have explained already, there are still a lot of things to do for downstream, but it's important already to think about considering upstream impact. Usually when we speak about the impact of a company, we will split them into the historical and existing impact. So that means all the things that have already happened and where avoidance and reduction is not possible anymore. And we also speak about new and ongoing impact. So that's the one where a company can act now and start thinking about how to avoid more, how to reduce impact on biodiversity. And when we speak about biodiversity, we consider ecosystems, species, so like abundance and extinction risk. In the future, they will also think about nature contribution to people and genetic diversity. So again, for this, we are still working on what will be the matrix and how we can do that. So it's important to start at least with ecosystem and species. So now, what does it mean for a company? So if we aim to be no net loss by 2020, when we speak about the scope for the company, it's on their new and ongoing impact, where they can reduce and avoid. And the objective is that not to make anything worse now. By 2020-30, they should try to become net positive. So that means that action needs to be taken as soon as possible. Again, we are still speaking about new and ongoing impact. And to reach that, it will be important for a company to set up some near-term outcome targets. By 2050, we aim for a full recovery for nature. So that means that at that point, company will have to work on the existing and historical impact. And it is expected that company will make a proportional a contribution which will be proportional to the restoring historical impact. So that means this contribution is not set up now. It's not clear yet how much it will be and how it will be estimated, but that will depend on the type of impact that they are having, the capacity of the company, and the context. So by context, we mean, for example, the landscape in which they are working. So what are the practical implications for a company? So for the new and ongoing impact, a company will have to apply the traditional mitigation hierarchy. So that means to avoid where it's feasible, to reduce as much as possible the impact, and then to apply the traditional net gain. So by that, we mean that when it's not possible to avoid and reduce, it will be necessary to compensate for this impact. There are a lot of experience already about that, and we will speak a bit more about some example of experience this afternoon, in the session this afternoon. About the existing impact, company will have to work on the regeneration of working ecosystem, for example, to help to set up some more sustainable practices. They will have to help protecting and restore natural ecosystem. And for that part, there will be more flexibility on the type of gains that they will have to achieve. So more generally, it will be very important for company to set up some near-term positive impact, to also act on transformative action, so to help the system to change and to make sure that we will have some permanence in the gains that will be achieved. And they will also have to work on positive outcomes for people. So as you can see on this graphic, there has been a lot of evolution in how companies are working on biodiversity. So in the 19th, companies were focusing on some specific impact on biodiversity. It was not always related to their activities. Between 2000 and 2020, companies have more and more started working on their direct footprint and working based on their direct footprint and focusing on some priority biodiversity. Now there is really the willingness that companies work on their value chain too, and that they focus on all biodiversity. So what is important is to be net positive by 2030. Companies need to take action now. There are plenty of no-regret action that can be set up. It's really important to start acting now. And one of the first steps to do that will be to start measuring the footprint. So even if it's not perfect, there are already a lot of things that can be done. There are a lot of tools that are existing. And yeah, the selection of the tools will depend on what company aims to do, and we can help them to identify what is the most appropriate for them. So this is an example of a company we are working with right now. So that's Vittel. So Vittel have started to understand the impact on biodiversity. So right now what they've done is to use the global biodiversity score to measure the impact on ecosystem. there is already some plan to start using the STAR metric, so the species strata abutment and restoration metric, to get some score on the species impact. So they don't have target right now, they are working on that, but there are still a lot of action that have been planned and that they actually had already think about even before having their footprint. So, for example, to reduce their footprint, they are thinking they are switching to recycled packaging, and they are also working on reducing carbon emission. For the other, for the carbon that cannot be reduced, they have a compensation strategy through carbon credit. They are also working on accelerate their action around vital source to protect and restore the land and the water. They are currently working on some program to preserve and regenerate ecosystem in Europe. And they have also some action more related to the transform, which is, for example, to support some development of innovative packaging solution to increase the recycled material. Thank you. Yes, so just this is the link to engage with science-based target and start acting now. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Adeline. So what we'll do now is we'll just have approximately sort of 40 minutes or so to have a panel discussion and also to be able to take any questions from the audience. But perhaps what I'd like to start with, and going back to Johnny, what you were discussing right at the beginning of this session, around this concept of nature positive. You know, we've heard over the last couple of years, we've gone from discussing things around no net loss for biodiversity, and then terms such as net gain have come up, net positive impact, as Mark is talking about in relation to BP. With this new concept of nature positive, how does that differ, and how does that sort of demonstrate the evolution of thinking that's going on within the business and nature community at the moment?
Yeah, you know, this is in some ways one of those difficult nuts to crack, because the world is looking for a very simple, clear definition of nature positive, and businesses are looking to answer the question, am I a nature positive business? Am I not a nature positive business? The reality is that, as you've seen, particularly for businesses with very complex downstream, upstream operations, a vast amount of data and very complex relationships with their upper supply chains, for example, within landscapes where they don't necessarily have full control of what's going on, because the local context in which we were talking about is maybe as much as a driver as what's happening in those landscapes as the business relationship with the commodities it's taking from that landscape is. All these factors combined, I think, make it very difficult for us to say a company can achieve a kind of nature positive point in time. What is, I think, possible is for us to say that a business is committed to becoming nature positive and is on a journey to being nature positive, and is setting in motion, and use that word motion again, taking action towards taking action on a number of fronts to become to generate nature positive outcomes. So this has been a big discussion in the Dsbtn network, the difference between nature positive outcomes and nature positive as a kind of state. So I still think it's a live discussion, and I wouldn't want to say that action is kind of predicated on us getting this exactly right. It's not. We can take action now. I think the most important message to say today is that every business, if they could commit to taking some actions based on the available science, can go on that journey towards becoming nature positive and generating nature positive outcomes. I think we can all agree on that much, but it would be interesting to see what the other panelists have to say, because I know this is a live discussion within the Dsbtn network at the moment.
Thank you, Johnny. And yeah, I think it would now be good just to have a sort of an investigation of what everyone else thinks about that. So, Mark, I wonder if I could ask you to to talk about what you think nature positive is and how that relates to your MPI commitment, for
Yeah,
example.
sure, great. Thanks very much. And it is it's a difficult question because we don't really know yet exactly what it is. I think perhaps if I can just give some reflections on what I think it is. I think perhaps we got MPI at the site level. The next level up is, of course, nature positive at that corporate level, which I think is a bit clearer, where at the corporate level you're delivering MPI on your projects or your products, but you're also embedding biodiversity into your business decision making. And the two main ones there in terms of your risk management processes, and BP, we've been doing that for about 20 odd years in terms of biodiversity. And the other key one is about your capital resource allocation, when you're deciding, are we as a company going to be going into solar? Are we going to be going into wind? Those big strategic questions when we look at the financial implications of those. But getting biodiversity into those sort of decisions, and this is where I think some of the natural capital accounting becomes really valuable in that piece. We are starting to look at that. Not easy, because how do you assess biodiversity impacts at that sort of very holistic level? It's very, very tricky. Value chain level, then next up from that, absolutely working with your partners and your suppliers is absolutely critical, and influencing those to have a similar sort of approach, taking more of a landscape approach to what you're looking at in terms of value chain, understanding what the customer's needs are, understanding the implications, and there's a whole range of different things you're going to have to look at the value chain, which again is understanding what that actually is at this time. So it's going to be an interesting journey how that comes out in the next couple of years, but it's not going to be easy.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Adeline, I wonder if you could share, you said you're working with a number of companies on this. Is there similar thinking coming out of these, or are they all approaching this in slightly different ways?
Well, I think they're all approaching that in more or less the same way, but then they don't have the same challenge, they don't have the same data available. So what is important is to focus first on what is the data available, understand better where may be the main impact, where they should focus first, where they need to understand a bit more about their impact. So there is a global thinking on how to improve and how to act, and I think that is what is important, and obviously depending on the sector, the challenge and the question won't be the same.
Thank you very much. And yeah, Clem, your thoughts on Nature Positive and the work with GSK?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't really speak for GSK in general, so it's just more my overall thought about this. But yeah, I think what the other panelists have said is quite right. We do have to act. I mean, what is really good with Dsbtn is that it's kind of getting to the details, because often when we see these big commitments, we're a bit asking, okay, how are you planning on achieving that? And here we're really developing a method when we go from assessing really the impact all the way through actually how you're going to track once you've done something about it. So yeah, I think it's really the message on this is, even if we don't know yet everything about nature positive and what it means and everything, I think we know that we're going to a common direction of travel where we want not only not to do any harm, but also actually having something that restores nature is. I think we could all agree on this. And there are tools out there. There are things that can help company get started. And as Adeline was also mentioned in her presentation, there are definitely no regrets type of action. I think even if you don't have a grand scheme of what your strategy should be to become nature positive, get started on one hand on that assessment, try and understand your nature footprint. And then on the other hand, go for the quick wins, the one that you're already aware that will get a positive impact. So you can start on both fronts and really get started for these long-term commitments.
Perfect, thank you. So again, just moving to a slightly different topic. You were talking before, Johnny, I think you mentioned around what we can learn from SBTI and what they've done on climate. What do we think that the challenges will be similar, that we'll share? And then where do you think the key gaps are going to be where we are in new ground with nature being so different?
Yeah, well, I touched upon this earlier, that there's a world of difference, obviously, between setting climate targets and setting nature targets. And there's much more complexity. So I think we have to accept that. And that's why the work is going to take some time, but it shouldn't be an excuse for inaction. Above and beyond saying that, I mean, I would say for actually, can I just come back to the issue of nature positive, because there's what wasn't mentioned there was of course the historical question of, you know, companies been established for a long time. They've had in some cases a colossal impact on biodiversity, and that is also a kind of hanging question, you know. So around this issue of claiming nature positivity. So how far do you go back? I know there are companies now that are pledging that they are going to become on the climate side of things, carbon neutral by taking action from now on, which will kind of, I don't know, assuage the sins of the past, so to speak. But that is, I think, a live question in terms of this concept of nature positive as well, which is one of the reasons why it's quite a contentious area to say, you know, yes, we are a nature positive company. The danger, of course, by going too quickly to a definition of nature positive is that there could be accusations of lack of rigor and greenwash, but if we say go on a trajectory towards nature positive outcomes, you know, we will create momentum and create action, whilst at the same time possibly avoiding some of the challenges from the more vociferous members of the NGO community. So you know, it's possibly a pragmatic decision to use the term nature positive outcomes at this point, anyway. But in answer to your question, yeah, I mean, I think we've touched upon this. I think there is a whole degree of complexity, particularly this issue of the allocation of impact within a local context, within a landscape context. Because if you're a company like GSK and you're sourcing materials from a particular place in the world, there's going to be all sorts of different governance issues, cultural issues, many other actors, you know, the legislative framework that is operating in that space, which are all going to be responsible for what's going on in that particular kind of part of the world where that commodity might be being sourced from. We're trying to figure some of this stuff out through UNEP WCMC has a big project which it's running from funds from the UK research institutes called the Trade Hub, where we're looking at around about 10 agricultural commodities and tracing those agricultural commodities from a very, very hyper-local, from the hyper-local to the kind of mega-global, and everything that happens in between, and trying to understand those pathways, trying to get a handle on that so we can actually then start to make policy decisions to drive more sustainability in those agricultural commodities supply chains. And we're coming up against, you know, considerable complexity, even if you just take it on a commodity by commodity basis. When you then start applying that to a single company with sometimes many different facets to their business, it is an extraordinarily difficult challenge. So this is why I say it's, you know, it is a lot more complex than the climate. We can be inspired by the SBTI model and their focus on action, what they've achieved, the figures I gave you before of a 25% extra above the industry standard. But we've got to dig into that complexity and see if we can simplify it as quick as possible and get it out to the business community as quick as possible. And that's what we're working on at the moment. So,
thanks. And yeah, actually touching on something you've just picked up there, Mark, I wonder if you're able to give us a little bit of the thinking around BP's commitment and how that is committing to net positive on projects from next year, and how the company plans to sort of integrate that with the legacy projects that they may have had, and you know, those impacts as you consider a nature positive approach.
Sure, I'll have a go. I think the first point is in terms of how do you actually assess or quantify those legacy or historical impacts. because, as we've said, nature is so complicated. You may have seen a change in a habitat or species or ecosystem. You have no idea why that change has happened. It could be natural fluctuations, or it could, of course, be for the project. So how do you actually quantify that? And then how do you actually attribute that to a particular activity, which is really, really difficult. So my immediate response to that is you just have to look where you are now and take action now for the impacts you're going to be having in the future, and do what you can. I think on your slide you talked about existing operations, and yes, we have to be doing things about our existing operations and our existing impacts and some of the legacy issues, and hopefully that will come through a little bit in the methodology. But it is really difficult to be able to do that, be able to quantify that, and attribute a particular impact to a particular activity or particular project.
Thank you. And yeah, actually, so to progress again from that, this whole thing is around setting targets, but we still are going to be reliant on what data is needed. Where do we think the data are going to come from? Is that something a company is going to have to invest in? Is it something that we as a conservation community need to come together and find ways of generating that data in a more effective way? So I wonder, anyone on the panel has a thought around data? Adeline?
Well, it's a complex question. I think everyone must have a go at it. I think on the company side, it's really about, actually sometimes the data is already there. So it's just about finding where it sits and compiling it. It sounds simple, but it's not, but compiling it in a way that can be read by the sustainability teams or the people that will work on this. So definitely, I think there is a bit about reaching out to suppliers. So that's probably also on the company to do that. And here, I'm sure there is definitely a mixed bag. Like some companies have a lot of data already, others won't necessarily have it. And it can be building on existing initiatives. So that, back to what I was saying, usually company will have, already GSG emission data, but they might have, assessed their water use already. So it's something they can build on. And maybe for that, they already have mapped their sites and have a lot more data from their suppliers. So I think there is a huge part that companies can play. And then I think you're right. There is definitely a part for NGOs or general experts or people that are doing research on this to play as well. So these input-output modeling that I've mentioned can definitely help here to just fill the gaps, because companies won't have the information for all of this. And it's building through initiative like Trade Hub that Johnny has mentioned as well. Where they're trading this commodity by commodity, but it's going to build out from that and get more and more information. So the answer is everyone, either for primary, probably more company, or secondary, where NGO and expert can help, can definitely bring something to the table. I don't know.
Yeah, just to add that when we speak about the data, we have to split that into two, and it's the data about biodiversity, where we are working to try to provide more and more data that will be available, for example, at global layers. And STAR, I think, is a great example of a metric that is available now for companies to help them to understand impact on species. We are also working on different metrics for ecosystem. And so that's maybe one part where the experts and we have to work on that to make sure that we make that available for companies, because that will help them at the first stage to understand, to prioritize. And then, of course, there will always be at site the need to measure and to do some monitoring, but we also have to help them at a global level. And then there is the company side of the data, where they need to understand where are the impact and to gather some data. There are some issues with traceability. In some type of company, it's very difficult to have all this information for all the suppliers. It's super complex to get information from the supplier, so we have challenge there. It will really depend again on the sector. Some company have maybe a supplier chain that is a bit easier to map. For others, it will be very complex, but again, we can work with them, have something that will be maybe at high level first, and then we can investigate and help them to get better data in the future.
So just quickly, in relation to the MPI on projects, we've made it very clear to our projects that they will have to be undertaking a lot more detailed baseline surveys than they have been historically, and that is quite a significant cost. And actually, probably the biggest part of the cost of MPI is that baseline data collection, particularly because 80% of our operations on the marine environment and marine surveys are difficult. The key aspect in terms of the new innovation and technologies which are coming through to get those costs down, but also getting more data as well at the same time. But then also working the larger landscape with NGOs, governments, etc., and academia to share that data is also really important.
I was just going to say we're hearing the word complexity quite a lot, and probably it's not what you want to hear. You were hoping to come here to get some clarity rather than complexity, but we're all saying it's complex. So I'm going to say actually the data I don't think is too much of an issue at the global level. I think we've got, I'm saying enough of it. We've certainly got sufficient data to actually move to at that kind of global corporate level to be able to furnish companies with the right kind of data, the right kind of tools in order for them to set the right kind of targets to start taking action now. That's slightly different to the kind of EIA site level, where there's always going to be field-based data that's going to need to be collected before a major operation can take place. And so I think that's a slightly different issue and not necessarily what we're talking about today. But it'd be great, of course, if that information can then flow into the global data sets and refine them over time. And there's some great tools out there. IBAT, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment tool, is also is already world leading in this and is used extensively by many businesses at both that kind of corporate level and the site-based level. Encore is a tool that WCMC have been involved in developing, which assesses impacts dependencies on natural capital. That is developing rapidly. It's already, I think, an incredibly useful tool. It's going to become more useful because we've just attracted some more investment into the development of it, which is fantastic. So the team are going to be working on that in the next 6 months. So there's already existing tools out there. There's no excuse really for not using them. Maybe we need to lead the horse to water, and maybe we need to make these connections. But and there's plenty of consultancies, including the Biodiversity Consultancy, including organizations like UNEP, WCMC, and a myriad of other consultancies that can help connect businesses with these tools and actually use the science-based targets interim guidance to actually start setting those targets. And so we're there really in many ways. So despite the word complexity cropping up, I'd say we are possibly a lot more advanced than that suggests. It's just as scientists we or as a pseudo-scientist in my case, we are obviously focused on refining and refining these data sets, collecting more data and improving things all the time and improving that kind of scientific rigor and basis for what we're doing. So let's not use data as an excuse for not taking action. I suppose that's that's becoming the theme of today, I think.
Thanks, Jody. I think we'll just take it away from there with just we're there, right? We're done. We will all go home. Perhaps now we can give some time for the questions from the audience. Can I get a show of hands for anyone with a question? And just before we do, also to remind anyone on the live stream that they can enter some questions into the chat, and we'll be able to take those as well. If I can just ask you to introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas Nuvian. So I'm actually a local. So I live and work here in Marseille for a consultancy called J'entreprends pour la planète, which is focused on helping companies to better manage their impact and help them change their business models towards a more sustainable way of doing things. One of the big frustrations that we have today is that we do have lots of tools, as we mentioned, for understanding CO2 emissions and other pollutants such as plastic waste. The biodiversity is the one big hole in the whole scheme of things. And I wanted to know, in your opinion, is it possible or even a good thing to try to express biodiversity impact in one single unit. There have been work done by a French company called CDC Biodiversity using MSC per kilometer square. And I wanted to know if you think, again, if it's possible, if that's the way that we're moving to, or if it's just, not really feasible at all.
As I've got the microphone in my hand, maybe I can build on what Adeline was saying before. Sorry, take this off. Because you flashed up the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, kind of 4 tiers, which are species, ecosystems, the genetic level, which is a really interesting one, because I think even 5 years ago we thought that was uncrackable, but we're now beginning to think that maybe we could do that with some of the incredible technologies which have been developed by the likes of Naturemetrics, who are here. And of course the 4th one is nature's contributions to people, so that's the AKA ecosystem services, but we don't call them that anymore. So I think if I'm really honest, and maybe this is a personal opinion perspective, I don't think it's necessarily useful or honest, really, to use just one single figure, because nature is at least as complex as those 3 levels plus the human relationship with nature. But I think we can get down to kind of 4 possible, so it's not one ring to bind them all, but possibly 4 rings to bind them all. Of course, within that, then there's going to be a range of sub-indicators that kind of contribute to that number. I should say some of the really out there work that UNEP WCMC are doing includes modeling the entire global ecosystem. If you Google the Mattingly model, if you really want to see some very strange cutting edge stuff, whereby we're trying to kind of I suppose understand the interactions at the global ecosystem level and the complexity through very, very innovative modeling techniques. Have a look at that. And the other thing I was going to mention, I've just forgotten. Anyway, it'll come back to me in a second.
We heard that.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, no, sorry, I've remembered. The Multi-Dimensional Biodiversity Index is another project we're working on. We just published a paper on this quite recently. Can't remember what journal it's in. But the idea behind the Multi-Dimensional Biodiversity Index is to have something like a kind of GDP for nature. Can we achieve a kind of GDP for nature? But of course, that GDP for nature will be based on the idea behind the Multi-Dimensional Biodiversity Index is a bit like the Index of Multiple Deprivation that we have in the UK. And of course, the Index of Multiple Deprivation is made up of a number of different data sets. But you can go online and you can look at your town and you can see each ward in your town, where it sits on the Index of Multiple Deprivation. Wouldn't it be amazing if you could go to zoom in on Cambridge and look at my ward and see where it sat on the index of the multidimensional index for biodiversity, and then get in touch with my local councillor and say, why are we down at 20% when we should be up at, why is our score 23 when it should be 83? What are you doing about it? So that's very, very early stage, and it's quite conceptual at the moment, but it could amount to something. We're working with the Luke Hoffman Institute on the Multidimensional Biodiversity Index. But in answer to your question, I think there should be 4, not 1.
I think we heard that word complex again a couple of times in there, but
I'm so sorry.
Mark, I wonder, from your opinion, from a business, what is a useful way to be expressing this information about biodiversity?
It's a great question. I mean, perhaps come back to your question. The quick response is saying no, because of all the reasons above. And I also, I just come to mind, and it's a little bit, perhaps a bit controversial, but I think putting biodiversity down to a few metrics and numbers misses the point and the value of biodiversity. And I think there's the intangible benefits in biodiversity which aren't picked up in the metrics, and I think the danger of losing that value if we just get it down to a few numbers here and there. But that's a bit more controversial, perhaps. So I just pass.
I just wanted to add on the global biodiversity score. So yes, it's using the mean species abundance metric to measure impact on biodiversity, but you have to understand this mean species abundance as something to explain you the ecosystem intactness in the area. So that's not something specific about species, and you will always need additional metric to measure impact on the species at least, and then all the other things that we have explained.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything said above. I think the answer is no. I think you can always try to aggregate then afterwards all of the impact that you've seen in some sort of way, and compare things, maybe order of priority. But I think that's the kind of main thing you have, and purposefully, like you've seen, there is a number of impact areas in the Dsbtn, and they're not trying to simplify it to like one. There will always be a number of things that you can have a look at for impact on dependencies. So yeah, I agree.
I think that's actually a really good point about being able to look at this at different levels and then aggregate where needed to the useful level for the decision that you're trying to take. This was a similar thing that we covered yesterday or the day before, sorry, in the biodiversity indicators for site-based impacts session, where we can have these things at very, very granular site level, and that's fantastic if you're a site manager and that's how you're viewing biodiversity and you're managing it. But as we go up to corporate level, we do need some way to aggregate these to make those kind of larger scale decisions. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. Hi. So I'm Laura. I'm working in Luxembourg. I have to basically give advice to 200 companies about how to advance toward better biodiversity strategies, but also climate strategies. So I was wondering, when do you see a match coming between these two issues? Because right now we're talking about how to make better for nature and climate on the parallel, but I don't see any convergence right now. So I was wondering, is that part of the agenda? And also the other difficulty I'm having is to find the right assessment metric to provide to a company who's coming to me and asking which ones should I use, the IBET, the Anchor, the GBD. So where do you start when you want to start actually with what? Thank you.
Who on the panel would like to start with that one? So how do we integrate climate and biodiversity, and then where do we start?
Great, I'll take it. I mean, I think it depends on the company which tool is best. So, and actually what they're trying to answer. So, IBAT is probably much more effective at the kind of project site level, and Encore is more effective at the kind of corporate level. It's a really good question about, because we talk a lot about the fact that the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, two sides of the same coin, and much of the solution to the climate crisis, of course, lies within how quickly we restore nature in the next 10 years, and that's not just through deforestation, but what we do with the oceans is going to be critical as well, and what we do with wetlands. My favourite statistic is peatlands cover just 3% of the global land area, but they're responsible for as many emissions as the global aviation industry. So, there's a low-hanging fruit. Let's fix our peatlands, and so how do we make sure that we're capturing the carbon value of the interventions we might be making, or a company might be making in terms of its biodiversity actions? I think is a really good question. At a global level, UNEP WCMC, we've been doing some work with a range of partners on producing this nature map. I don't know if you've seen nature map, but it's taken biodiversity layers, carbon layers, and water layers, and overlaid those and produced a global map of where the hotspots of carbon, biodiversity, and water are. It's quite a high resolution, so you can now pretty much zoom in on anywhere on the planet, and you can see what's going on in terms of carbon, water, and biodiversity. And you can look at that pixel, and you can think, okay, that pixel is red. How do we turn it to green? So I think that's a real asset and that does actually bring the biodiversity and climate issues together, actually, in a very kind of neat spatial way. I'd say it's a resource more than a tool. But it's one of those resources which will probably have tools developed from it in the coming years. We're looking to kind of branch that out. But I think it really depends on the company which kind of tool you use. But come and speak to us, and we'll try and give you some pointers on that. Yeah.
Mark?
You know, I can just talk on the policies piece, actually. I think with the IPCC IPBES workshop report highlights that exact failing, that the problems we've gone down, climate policy, biodiversity policy, and they haven't been joined up. And that's one of the failings now. I think we are now starting to see those come together at last. What journey it's going to go through, how it's going to materialise, I don't know. But making those more holistic policy decisions is going to be really important. The whole sort of area around natural capital may play into that more than natural, and the social capitals may help in that regard. But so it's going to be really interesting to see how they merge together. And I think we also see that through we've got the TNFD and the TCF. I'm going to get an acronym now, aren't I? The CCF, the climate one, anyway. The way they merge together and how they're going to interlink and play off each other is going to be really interesting as well. So I think over the next couple of years we'll see that merging a little bit better. So yeah, fingers crossed.
I don't even
So I just realised I am here representing the Dsbtn Council, so I must point you towards the Dsbtn guidance as the first thing you should look at before you then start exploring other tools, because that that is how to undertake the journey, and you'll of course be using tools along the way, but that's what was missing, and I think that the publication of that guidance has been, which was the diagram that Clem put up, that arc diagram, I think is a very useful place to start conceptually.
Thanks, Johnny. It's always important to be able to remember which hat you've got on.
Yeah, and I think just one very quick point as well, on all the impact areas that have been identified actually in Dsbtn, climate change is one, so it actually is part of the ratings as well. So I think, you can always say in nature, climate change also impacts nature, so it will be included in there. So it just regroups everything.
Great, thanks. We'll take another question from the audience.
Hi, thanks. Warwick Mostert from Anglo American. So maybe just a perspective and then a question. We're grappling with the same issues around our NPI commitments and how we transition that to nature positive. A lot of what we're looking at from a nature positive is at that corporate level. And so the sort of holistic integrated approaches of all of our other work streams around carbon neutrality, around water stewardship, is where we think that that's kind of more of where the nature positive sits. So it's an interesting to hear much as what Mark was saying, how you sort of grapple it. So the sites are very much still focused on delivering on our net positive impact commitments, which is critically important. But how do we, at a group level and a corporate level, integrate some of this nature positive narrative? I guess it's what it is. To the question, and I think it's picked up on what Johnny was saying about my sense of the last couple of days is that there has been a lot of motion, but I don't see the action, So how do we move, or how do we encourage businesses to deliver on the action? And I think one of those frameworks that we've got is this global biodiversity framework. The target 15 for business is there's a target in there for companies and businesses to reduce their negative impact by 50%, but very little on a positive. So the positive says, and encourage a positive biodiversity outcome. So maybe a question for the panelists is, how do we need to push policy to be more prescriptive and actually say, we want to get away from a voluntary perspective in terms of what businesses should be doing, and push that policy perspective to say you actually want companies to be prescriptive, so you actually need to force the action on delivering positive biodiversity outcomes. Thank you.
That's a great question. Who would like to start on that one?
Yeah, great questions. It might be worth mentioning TNFD at this point, the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, which is in the process of being set up. I suspect that one of the recommendations that's going to come out of TNFD is to say that there needs to be some legislative base for disclosing impacts and dependencies on nature. I'll be a bit disappointed if it doesn't actually come out of TNFD. I mean, the European Union is already kind of moving on some of this already, but if we could have some kind of global guidelines, some kind of global standards, at least to guide lawmakers to put something on the statute books to make sure that businesses are actually reporting this stuff, that could be a real that could be a real driver for action. I mean, and I'd say the other thing, and it's interesting. You know, you're almost calling for more regulation there, which is I'm hearing. I'm hearing. I think I'm hearing more and more from business, but I know regulation's a dirty word sometimes. Or more. Let's say more effective legislation in this area, not regulation. And I think the other thing I'd say is we're still locked into a regime of massively perverse subsidies, which are flowing to create, you know, massively nature negative outcomes at the moment. Not least in the agricultural sector, but beyond the agricultural sector as well. And I think probably the biggest and quickest thing that governments could do is actually do a root and branch subsidy reform and align the incentives that they're passing out and the support they're giving for businesses to become nature positive. And I just don't see that happening. I mean, I've been attending these kind of events now for a couple of decades, and every time we talk about it, and it doesn't get talked about enough actually, but every time we talked about that, and there's never any action. Maybe I'm at the wrong Congress, you know, I need to be at the WTO or something, but you know, that is absolutely enormous. And until we fix that, you know, businesses are going to really struggle because they're going to keep getting money for doing bad things, you know, from governments. So there's got to be some join up there, I think, as well. But I'm hoping that TNFD will come up with some guidelines for legislators to say, you know, this is how it should be done in a light touch, supportive way, you know, all that kind of thing, not too heavy-handed.
So a couple of things there come to mind. First of all, yeah, there needs to be both carrot and stick aspect of it. Yeah, regulations, generally business are not shy of regulations as long as it's good regulations and it's consistently applied across different countries because we like, you know, for that consistency. So yeah, there's going to probably need aspects of regulations coming in place for different aspects. We are seeing more regulations coming in around net positive impact and net gains. We've seen that in the UK, EU, and many other states as well. And also, and just in terms of coming back to the reforms, I mean, I think we can go back to Agenda 21 in 1992. I think it's one of the objectives was to eliminate harmful subsidies back in 1992. And I agree there's been virtually no movement in that space over the last 20-odd years. Yeah. But I think the other aspect of it is actually not just reforming harmful subsidies, but actually providing incentives for businesses to actually get the carrot in the room for businesses to make that shift. And I think if you focus on that more, you're more likely to get businesses to be moving in that direction if they can see the opportunity in that space to reform and incentivize more net positive approaches in their companies. I think that's probably the approach to take. Horrendously very complicated. That word again, isn't it? It's very difficult and challenging how you do that. What does that actually mean? And my other caution there is just really understanding the unintentional consequences of some of those reforms. We don't want to end up in a different situation, a bad place in another 20 years' time because of not taking the right action now. So I think to be careful, but no easy solution to it, I'm afraid.
Okay. I think we probably just have about time for one more question, so I think we'll go online to Laura and see what questions we have.
We've seen with a number of companies that it can be a distraction and even deter company action to get lost in defining baselines, metrics and indicators. What are some ways to just get on with it, perhaps working towards shared targets at a jurisdictional level as a starting point?
Did we get the question?
We're working well that means. But now, in terms of, I think part of that question is, first of all, in terms of, companies need to understand, at least at a high level, their overall impacts. Where are the material impacts? Where's the key issues? Come out with a commitment or a position, and then turn that into action. I don't worry too much about the metrics and the targets and disclosures yet. That will follow over the next 3-5 years with all different initiatives going on. But identify, even just some of the small things which businesses can be doing, start doing things now. And putting them in place. A bit of a story, when we were putting forward the net positive impact to our board and executives about putting this forward as a position, I was quite nervous about it because I thought, they're just going to say no. Because we really want to understand what net positive impact actually mean and what the implications of a net positive impact understand that first before we made that commitment. But actually, we got the opposite. Got the opposite surprise. Got the opposite push, and said, "No, just do it." We work out how we're going to do it because it's important. Because we see investors talking about it, we see the civil society talking about it. Let's just put our position out there. We'll spend a year, 2 years working out how to do it. It's a bit of a journey, but be open about it at the same time. So it's just getting out there and doing it because it's an important thing to do, and we work out through that journey, working with everybody else trying to get there.
Yeah, and that's been a good journey to be on as part of that project, on trying to learn out how we do develop it step by step, and you understand as you learn how to do one thing, you realize what the next thing you need to do is. I think that's a really good way to approach it. Does anyone else have any comments on
Answer that question.
Yep.
I love that question, and it's a great question to end on. What I would say is, if you're a business, get 2 or 3 people together and say you're going to have next week. You're going to have a sprint on this issue. Here's a copy of the Dsbtn interim guidance. Here's some other links to websites with various tools to measure biodiversity. Get your heads around it very, very quickly. Reach out to whatever consultancy or organization that you think might be able to help, and then set a target, or set several targets around these issues, and then we'll refine those over time, and we'll get better, and there'll be more guidance coming out, and there'll be more tips coming out. But do that next week. Do that when you get back from this Congress, and do it quickly. Take some inspiration from those Silicon Valley people that do sprints all the time. Exhaustingly.
I'll just respond to the second part of that question about jurisdictional targets, and obviously we're seeing that for climate. I think that's going to be the interesting space for biodiversity, and I think for businesses, I think we'd like to see, because obviously we have MBSAPs, but very rarely are businesses or private sector mentioned in MBSAPs. What's the role of businesses in delivering the actions for national biodiversity action plans? So I think that's going to be a quite interesting area, and I think that will come out of the GBEF as sort of the implementation part of things. So it'll be quite interesting to watch. Yeah, I think.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. We've come to the end of the session. So first of all, I'd just like you to give a round of applause to them all. And I think, the key take-home here has been that it's complex, but it's not too complex that we can do something about it, and that we should really start taking action now. So thank you all for joining. And I think our next session after lunch will be also on this similar related topic, so please join that one as well. Thank you.